Hello everyone, this is Professor Koepke and this is my introduction to the autonomic nervous system. So typically I would do this on the whiteboard in class if we were in class right now, but we are not. So I came up with a two-slide PowerPoint that's going to walk us through and introduce us to the autonomic nervous system. If you've already watched those lectures on the autonomic nervous system, this is going to act as a good review of what you already learned or some of the things you learned in those lectures. If you haven't watched those lectures, this is going to act as an introduction. So again, this is meant to be done kind of on a whiteboard. And typically, if I'm doing a whiteboard drawing, I would expect the students to write out what I'm drawing. So I highly recommend, instead of just doing a screenshot or a picture of this, I would get a couple sheets of paper out, doesn't matter if it's lined paper, white paper, and draw all this out. So you should have a piece of paper in front of you. If you don't, maybe pause me and then get that paper. And you're going to start by writing nervous system at the top of your paper. And from there, we're going to break the nervous system down into the two major subdivisions, the somatic nervous system and then the autonomic nervous system. And the chapter is called the autonomic nervous system, but we also have to kind of do a little review of the somatic nervous system so we can make some comparisons. All right. So somatic nervous system, both of these systems have input, all right, from senses. They have parts of the CNS that are involved, and then they have motor output that controls organs or effectors. So just as a review, the somatic nervous system uses senses from touch, pain, temperature, a lot of other somatic senses. These senses you can think of as being on your skin, right? When you touch things, when you get hurt, temperature sensation, when you perceive that it's hot or cold out. We also use information from our special senses, vision, taste, smell, hearing. So that's kind of the sensory component. Then you got parts of the brain. A major part of the brain is going to be your cerebral cortex. And we use our primary motor area, for example, to send out signals to skeletal muscle in order to stimulate their contraction, which is a voluntary control. All right, so that's a little summary of the somatic nervous system. Autonomic is going to have senses from internal organs. So we call that visceral senses. So we'll be monitoring our internal environment. All right, so maybe we're monitoring blood pressure or blood chemistry, or maybe we're monitoring whether there's food in the GI tract or whether there's urine in the urinary bladder. So we're going to use a lot of our visceral internal senses. There's parts of the CNS involved in interpreting that. One of the major areas is your hypothalamus, which does a lot of this control, but it involves other parts of the brain as well. The motor side of things, so what are we controlling with our autonomic nervous system? We're going to control the heart, so maybe we'll speed it up, slow it down, or make it beat harder. Any organ that has smooth muscle, we control that smooth muscle with the autonomic nervous system. So that would be the respiratory tract. So we can regulate the diameter of the airways, for example, how much, and that'll help determine how much air can get down into your lungs. Maybe we're regulating the urinary tract. So maybe we're stimulating the bladder so we can urinate. Or maybe we're inhibiting that. The GI tract has smooth muscle. The reproductive tract has smooth muscle. Blood vessels have smooth muscle. So maybe we need to dilate or constrict blood vessels to kind of change blood flow. So again, anything with smooth muscle, that's involuntarily controlled by the autonomic nervous system. And then most of our glands. So if we need to sweat, we're going to use the autonomic nervous system. If we need to produce saliva, if we need to produce tears, if we need to produce certain hormones, maybe it's the pancreas that needs to produce certain hormones. Those glands are controlled by the autonomic nervous system. So that shouldn't be too new to us. We learned about these two subdivisions when we kind of started the nervous system chapters ago. What we're really going to hunker down onto and learn the details is the subdivisions of the autonomic nervous system, known as the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. All right, so the autonomic nervous system kind of splits into two motor divisions. So they share the sensory. So the brain gets all this information. Then, based on the information and kind of the situation the body is in, we will either increase our sympathetic nervous system activity and decrease parasympathetic, or we'll increase parasympathetic and decrease sympathetic. So we never activate both. We usually kind of shift from one over to the other. And the one that's more dominant is parasympathetic. So your body is in more of a parasympathetic situation throughout the body or throughout the day, a lot more than sympathetic. But we need to be able to shift. All right. So this first slide, so this first piece of paper that you're drawing out, is just introducing kind of the difference between the two. So we're going to start with the sympathetic division. We often call it fight or flight responses, and that's a big one. That's going to be used a lot. Again, maybe even moving on into a medical program, you're going to hear fight or flight all the time. So fight usually means, all right, you're in some sort of kind of emergency situation and you got to combat that situation. Flight means maybe you're going to just try to get out of that situation. All right, fight or flight responses. Another way to think of sympathetic division is your E situations. All right, so E situations include energy release and utilization. So anytime your body needs energy, how we increase that energy supply is activate our sympathetic nervous system. So what do we mean by energy? We typically mean glucose. All right, glucose is our number one source of energy. So we're going to increase blood sugar. All right, so there's a number of organs involved in that. Maybe we're going to break down fat. So fat has energy as well. Triglycerides have energy. So maybe we will break down fat, and that's called lipolysis. So that's a way to increase energy. So a lot of things that involve an energy kind of production needs to be activated by the sympathetic division. Another E situation is emergencies. So if your body is in an emergent situation, maybe you got in a car accident and you need to figure out a way, to maybe get out of that vehicle, or, you're in a burning building and you need to figure out how to survive that situation. We often call those acute stresses. Acute means it happens really fast, all right, and you got to deal with that emergency very quickly. As opposed to chronic stress would be kind of a more longer developing, chronic over a longer period of time stress. That's kind of a different situation. Another E is exercise. So a lot of times I'll tell you, just think about what your body is doing when you're exercising. All right, it's increasing blood sugar because you need more energy to exercise. Maybe your airways are going to be dilated because you need more air, all right, because what's in that air is oxygen, and that's required for energy during exercise. Another E situation is excitement. So when you get excited about something, your sympathetic activity goes up. All right, you might perceive maybe your heart rate going up. And embarrassment. Embarrassment, when you're embarrassed about something, maybe you get flush, right? You get a little red. Maybe you start to sweat. All right, sweating is a sympathetic activity. All right, so you think of your E situations, fight or flight. You might think of stress, so the S in stress. Some people use that S in stress to remember sympathetic, the S in sympathetic. Injuries, any threat to your body, you're going to activate the sympathetic division. One other thing that you're going to learn about in the lectures is there's another name for the sympathetic division. This is more anatomical name. So it's based on the fact that signals come out of the CNS using the thoracic area of your spinal cord and the lumbar region of your spinal cord. So the sympathetic division is often known as the thoracolumbar division. All right, and that just has to do with where does the neurons come out of the CNS. And then the last thing I want you to remember is, at some point there's a target organ, right? We're telling organs to do something. And those organs need to be able to respond to epinephrine and norepinephrine. So they need to have what's known as adrenergic receptors. When you see that word adrenergic, think adrenaline, and adrenaline is epinephrine, all right? Or noradrenaline is norepinephrine. For us, those two molecules, whether you're epinephrine or norepinephrine, are going to do the same thing. So we're going to keep it pretty simple. So the targets need to be able to detect epinephrine and norepinephrine. So they use adrenergic receptors, and those can be classified either as alpha or beta adrenergic receptors. All right. So for example, the heart has beta receptors. That's how the heart knows when it's getting told by epinephrine or norepinephrine to speed up. All right. So these are all things related to the sympathetic division. Parasympathetic, we often say it's rest and digest. So this is more when you're in a resting state. All right, so you're not in a fight or flight, you're at rest. And again, that's more dominant. If you think about throughout the day, more of your body, or more time, your body is more often in a resting state than a fight or flight state. We often use SLUD to remember some of the situations. So the S in SLUD is salivation, so production of saliva. All right, and remember, that's a digestive process. The L is lacrimation. Lacrimation is the production of tears. All right, so tears are stimulated by parasympathetic neurons. The U stands for urination. So in order to urinate, that bladder has to be stimulated with parasympathetic neurons. And if you think about when it's kind of easiest to urinate, it's when you're resting. All right, it's very difficult to urinate when you're exercising, or you're in an emergency situation, you're trying to escape your car when you get in a car accident, right? Your body isn't going to, oh wait, let me urinate. Now, sometimes we have what's called paradoxical fear. So that's when the fear is so extreme that you get an overwhelming parasympathetic response. So it's a paradox is when it's kind of opposite of what you would think occurs. So some people get so scared they might urinate themselves, they might defecate themselves. That's paradoxical fear. Urination and defecation are parasympathetic responses, but they could happen when you have extreme fear or an extreme emergency. So that's kind of a rare situation. The two Ds stand for digestion and defecation, which those are both digestive processes, right? So 3 of these 5 are all based on that, knowing that, digestion is stimulated by parasympathetic neurons. You could also remember peace. So when the body is at peace, right, you're at rest, that P might help you remember parasympathetic. And then the information, the motor neurons, come out of the craniosacral areas of your CNS. Cranio means brain, right? And what we're talking about are 4 of your cranial nerves transmit parasympathetic signals. Cranial nerve 3, which is oculomotor. Cranial nerve 7, which is facial. Cranial nerve 9, which is glossopharyngeal. And cranial nerve 10, which is vagus. And then you have some sacral nerves that are way down at the bottom of the spinal cord. So notice that one major difference between the two divisions is where the motor neurons come out of the CNS. It's basically totally opposite areas of your CNS. And then the target organs require different types of receptors. These receptors are called cholinergic receptors. So whereas adrenergic receptors are stimulated by epinephrine and norepinephrine, cholinergic receptors are stimulated by acetylcholine. All right, so these might be 2 new words, but you're going to hear about them a lot. Adrenergic, just think adrenaline, epinephrine, norepinephrine. Cholinergic, think acetylcholine. And those receptors can be classified a little differently. You have what's called nicotinic receptors and muscarinic receptors. So those are the 2 types of cholinergic receptors. And then there's even subcategories of those, but we won't go there. And these are named based on the fact that some of these receptors are activated by nicotine, or they're activated by a molecule called muscarine, which is from a certain type of mushroom. All right, so again, we're just kind of learning some terms, kind of getting to know the big picture here. One thing I'm going to emphasize a lot is medications. So a lot of our medications are based on altering the autonomic nervous system. All right, and I wanted to remind you that, you know, I'm kind of coming from a pharmacologist view. All right, so I like kind of learning medications and drugs. So you're going to learn some medications in this chapter. But a lot of our medications either block one of these responses by either sympathetic or parasympathetic, or they might activate. If we block something, we call that an antagonist. So when we get to the heart, you're going to learn about beta blockers, beta antagonists. Those block the beta adrenergic receptors on your heart. So they block the effect of epinephrine and norepinephrine. So those medications will actually slow the heart down because we're blocking epinephrine and norepinephrine, which speed the heart up. If you see the word agonist, those activate. So if you're a beta agonist, you would actually activate those beta receptors. All right. So that, again, that's some of the terminology that we use when we learn about medications that either block something or activate something. And usually it's receptors. We're either blocking the receptor or stimulating the receptor. All right, next slide. So new sheet of paper. All right, this new sheet of paper, across the top, you're going to put CNS, then motor neurons of the somatic nervous system and autonomic nervous system, and then effectors. So basically what this drawing is going to do is show you how the motor neurons of these divisions work. All right, so we're not doing the sensory part. We're doing how does the signal get from the CNS to the effector organs, the organs that we're controlling. All right, somatic we already know. All right, we learned about somatic motor neurons back when we studied muscle. Right, we learned about that neuromuscular junction. So I'm going to put this up right now. All right, so let me explain what this is. This is a simple way to draw a neuron. All right, we could draw a fancy neuron, but a dot is going to represent the cell body of the neuron. All right, this line is going to represent the axon of the neuron, and then these are the terminals. So these would be the axon terminals or the end bulbs. All right, so this represents a somatic motor neuron. Starts in the CNS. All right, so it starts in either part of the brain or part of the spinal cord. It extends out inside of a nerve. All right, so notice what we're controlling here is the biceps muscle. So there's the biceps brachii. So this neuron would be packaged inside the musculocutaneous nerve. All right, that's the nerve that contains the motor neurons that stimulate the biceps. All right, so that's just giving you a little context. All right, so we already knew that. We even knew this. We knew that the neurotransmitter that these neurons release is acetylcholine. So these little blue dots represent acetylcholine, right? They're going to cross the little synaptic cleft, stimulate the skeletal muscle. All right, again, we already knew that. Now, one thing that might be new is the fact that these neurons are myelinated. All right, they happen to be myelinated neurons. And because they release acetylcholine, we can call them cholinergic neurons. So all we're doing is naming the neuron based on the neurotransmitter that it releases. All right, so these are cholinergic neurons. Now, we also can now name the receptors on the skeletal muscle cells. Now, before we just learned that they were acetylcholine receptors. Well, now we know we could call those cholinergic receptors, and we can add the specific type, which is nicotinic receptors. All right, so we're adding a little bit more detail to this kind of pathway in which we can stimulate skeletal muscle. All right, so that's how the somatic nervous system uses motor neurons to stimulate skeletal muscle. All right, so now we're going to learn how the autonomic nervous system works. And I'm going to give you a minute to draw these out a little bit. All right, so these are neurons. All right, now we're using a little bit different color, and you're going to see what that means in a minute. You'll notice that, the sympathetic is going to use 2 neurons. All right, this we'll talk about what that's going to do in a minute. Parasympathetic also uses 2 neurons. So one major difference, and you'll be asked, is that the autonomic nervous system uses a 2 motor neuron pathway, whereas somatic just used 1. All right, you can get the signal from the CNS to the effector using 1 neuron. Now, there's many neurons packaged together, but what we mean by 1 versus 2 is that in the autonomic, 1 neuron gets the signal coming out of the CNS, but then it has to stimulate another neuron. And then that neuron will stimulate the effectors, which we're going to put in this space here. All right, so hopefully you have these drawn out. If not, pause me, draw these neurons out, and then we'll continue. Okay, so we're going to start with sympathetic. Well, actually, let's start with the effectors. We already know that, right? Remember that the autonomic nervous system, whether it's sympathetic or parasympathetic, is going to have an effect on the heart. It's going to have an effect on smooth muscle organs. These are just a couple of them here. So the airways, so these little airways have smooth muscle in them, and it's really the tiny little ones do. So we can regulate the size of those smaller little airways. The stomach has smooth muscle. All right, so that wall of the stomach has smooth muscle. This represents a gland here. That's the pancreas. All right, but also what's shown here is a gallbladder. Gallbladder has smooth muscle. And then this part right here is part of the small intestine, which has smooth muscle. Now, do you need to draw these? No, you could just write, airways, digestive organs, glands. Here's another gland, salivary glands. So again, you don't have to draw these out, fancy. I just, put pictures because it's a little more visual. All right, so just write heart, smooth muscle, glands. All right, you don't have to draw these pictures. All right, so that's the effector. So now the question is, how do we get from the CNS to these effectors? Well, the sympathetic division is going to use 2 neurons to get there, so is parasympathetic. So somehow these 2 neurons have to connect, right? This neuron has to stimulate this neuron. Where these connections occur, right, where you have this neuron releasing a neurotransmitter and stimulating this neuron, those are called autonomic ganglia. Ganglia is plural, ganglion is singular. So this would represent an autonomic ganglion. Now remember what the word ganglion means. It means there's a cluster of cell bodies in the periphery, in the PNS. All right. So again, there's going to be a whole bunch of these neurons. There's going to be a whole bunch of these. And because there's a whole bunch of these cell bodies, it forms this larger kind of swollen area of the nerve. All right. So inside the autonomic ganglia is where these 2 neurons are going to be connected together. We use that ganglion as a way to name the 2 neurons. If you are before the ganglion, you are preganglionic. If you are after it, you're postganglionic. So this would be called a sympathetic preganglionic neuron. This one down here is a parasympathetic preganglionic neuron. And then this is the sympathetic postganglionic. And this is the parasympathetic postganglionic. So we're just naming them based on where are they, before the ganglion or after. And you'll notice the postganglionic neurons are the ones that control the effectors ultimately, right? They're the ones that are going to be stimulating or inhibiting these organs. And notice their color's different. That's super important because you want that heart, for example, to do something different when it's being stimulated by the sympathetic division than it is when it's being stimulated by the parasympathetic division. All right? Okay. What else can we add here? Again, if you're falling behind in your drawing, just pause me. So next thing we add is, all right, myelinated or unmyelinated. So you'll notice all these preganglionic neurons are myelinated and they're cholinergic. All right. Now, blue means they're cholinergic. All right, for down here, these colors. So myelinated cholinergic, myelinated cholinergic, myelinated cholinergic. This one is not myelinated and this one's not myelinated. So the postganglionic neurons are unmyelinated. All right, we already said they're cholinergic, so we could add in acetylcholine here. So these preganglionic neurons, no matter whether you're sympathetic or parasympathetic, or this guy, which we'll talk about what that guy is in a minute, they all are cholinergic, they all release acetylcholine. All right? So far, acetylcholine is the only neurotransmitter we've talked about on this image. Okay. Again, pause me if you need to catch up. All right, next thing we can add is if you're a postganglionic neuron, you need to know when you're getting stimulated by acetylcholine, so you're going to need to have receptors. And they have very similar receptors as skeletal muscle. They're nicotinic receptors. So remember, this would be where the receptors need to be, right? Theoretically, there would be dendrites here. So the postganglionic neurons have nicotinic receptors. Okay? Now what are we going to do? We're going to label the postganglionic neurons as far as whether they're myelinated and then what kind of neurotransmitter they release. So the postganglionic sympathetic neurons are unmyelinated, adrenergic. So they release norepinephrine. So red is representing norepinephrine. All right. When we activate the sympathetic division, we also want to stimulate adrenal glands. All right, so that's what this neuron's doing. This neuron is not stimulating another neuron. It's going directly to the adrenal glands to tell the adrenal glands to secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine into the blood. All right, these guys are going into the bloodstream. And again, these are the ones we often refer to as adrenaline or noradrenaline. All right, so now we've got, when we're in a fight or flight situation, we've got norepinephrine being released from the nervous system. We have epinephrine and norepinephrine being put into the blood from the endocrine system. That's the adrenal glands. They produce hormones. So that's a way to really boost our fight or flight responses. All right. Now, that's again fight or flight. If we're at rest, we don't activate these, we activate this. And the postganglionic parasympathetic neurons are going to release acetylcholine. So they are unmyelinated cholinergic neurons. So what does this all mean? All right. It means that these organs here need to be dual innervated. All right. Dual innervated means they're controlled by two different types of neurons. We want these neurons to do one thing to the heart, like speed it up, whereas these neurons are going to slow it down. All right. So this heart needs to have receptors for both norepinephrine, epinephrine, right? Those are going to be the same thing, but also have receptors for acetylcholine. So now that heart knows, all right, if I'm in a fight or flight, I need to speed up because norepinephrine and epinephrine are telling me to speed up. When I'm at rest, that goes away, and instead acetylcholine is going to tell me to slow down. And that's true for all these organs, in that epinephrine, norepinephrine is going to tell the organ to do one thing during fight or flight. Acetylcholine is going to tell that organ to do something different during rest. So for example, your respiratory tract, these little airways, we want them dilated during fight or flight so you can get more air. We want them constricted during rest because you don't need as much air. All right. Stomach, we want to activate the stomach during rest. So acetylcholine will stimulate the stomach at rest, whereas epinephrine and norepinephrine will actually inhibit your stomach during fight or flight. So those are the things we get into the second half of the PowerPoints, the lectures. I'm not going to touch on that today or on this video, all right? But that's where we ultimately need to go. We got to understand, given an organ, what is the sympathetic division going to do to it to help with fight or flight? What is the parasympathetic division going to do to it to help during rest? All right? And that's all stuff we're going to learn about in the actual lectures. All right? So that means that these organs need to have two different types of receptors. These organs are going to need adrenergic receptors, all right, to know when these epinephrine and norepinephrine molecules stimulate it. They also need to have a cholinergic receptor so they can detect when acetylcholine is being utilized. All right. So again, hopefully this is a good introduction. There's a lot of terminology, so that's why I wanted to kind of do this separate introduction type video. But hopefully these drawings will help. The PowerPoint's going to show a little bit more fancy drawings. I thought these would be good ways to show you in a way that you can actually draw things out. All right. Okay, hopefully that helped. Good luck. Autonomic nervous system, I will tell you, is probably the most important chapter we learn in A&P1. because we're going to use this information a lot in A&P2, and you're going to use it a lot in, say, a pharmacology course or a medical course that you might be enrolled in future programs like nursing or PA school or med school. All those programs that require you to understand, how these internal organs are regulated, but also how we use medications to change how the nervous system is acting.